Alex O'Connor. If you've ever done any sort of soul searching online, you've probably heard of this name before. This episode is going to be a bit of a different episode. Usually I would bring someone on, interview them, and we would have a bit of a chat and a back and forth about a certain topic. But this one is something that I personally am very passionate about, and I've been waiting a while until I actually release something like this. But I've decided that now is probably that time. Alex O'Connor is going to be the best example of this, I think. For context, Alex O'Connor is an atheist commentator. Well, at least I believe he's atheist because he has a video saying why I don't believe in God. Alex O'Connor is a prominent atheist commentator who I actually really respect. He, I think, is a few years younger than me and has already created a huge audience that bases themselves around philosophical critical thinking. And he does a good job. Recently, he debated Dinesh D'Souza in a debate on why he doesn't trust the Bible. And unfortunately, I wouldn't have picked Dinesh as the best opponent, and it showed. Alex, in terms of at least strict debate criteria, dominated the floor. I wanted to cover Alex's opening statement. It's just shy of 10 minutes, and there's a whole bunch of things that I wanted to go through in this 10-minute opening statement. I believe it does a really good job of showing, I guess, three major issues that I have with discussions in the religious, philosophical, conversational sphere, whatever you want to call it. Alex has essentially asked the question, why don't I trust the Bible? And he goes on to, well, at least he begins by making quite a good argument. I think he lays his argument out quite well. And honestly, even to the untrained Christian, this is a very, very convincing 10 minutes. He does a really good job of explaining his point and methodically going through and seemingly proving his point. But I have three main issues with this introductory statement. And I want to make these three main issues very, very clear. Because every person on the planet believes that they are truth-seeking, but I don't believe that is actually the case. I don't believe that human beings are inherently truth-seeking. I think that first and foremost, human beings are self-seeking. And sometimes we can cloud ourselves into thinking that we are truth-seeking when really we have just been self-seeking. I'm going to use this video to show that while Alex may have put forward a seemingly powerful set of arguments, none of them are really genuinely truth-seeking. I'm going to outline those three major issues now that I mentioned before. The first one is that the contradictions don't actually unravel any of the main points or claims of Scripture. I have an issue with the contradictions that he makes being made to seem like they have weight that they don't actually have. I'm going to give you an analogy first. Say we have two witnesses describing a miracle that Jesus has performed. The two accounts are as follows. Person one says, he turned water into wine, and there was enough for 100 guests. And the second person says, he turned water into wine, and there was enough for 150 guests. This is indeed a contradiction if we look only at the number of guests. But both witnesses claim that water was turned to wine. The contradiction of the number of guests does not invalidate the agreement of the water turning into wine. The Bible is trying to show that Jesus is a miracle performer. It is not a people counting tool. Please, as we go through this video, keep these issues in the forefront of your mind. I'm going to go to the second issue now. I have an issue with how much damage someone can deal in 9 to 10 minutes. These concerns or apparent contradictions that Alex lists, none of them are actually posed as evidence arguments. They're simply posed as potential questions or potential unanswered questions, and kind of just giving your brain the ability to potentially fill in the blanks. This is not how proposing an argument works. I'm going to repeat the statement that I said before, and I'm going to pose it as a challenge to you as the listener. Once again, humans are not inherently truth-seeking beings. And to prove this, ask yourself the question, what would truth-seeking look like for Alex O'Connor? Keep this in your mind as we watch this video. Now understand that whatever you have come up with, you must go and do yourself if you want to say that you've sought the truth as far as you can comprehend. Don't get me wrong. If you don't or can't do this, or don't have the time or whatever, that's fine. But you cannot make the claim that you're fully truth-seeking in this matter, because you have just comprehended ways that you can seek the truth further than where you currently are at. This perfectly leads to my third problem or issue, which is that the act of asking questions is so much easier than exploring answers. There are scholars that have done the work. There are answers to be found for most of his questions. We are always learning more about history and language, and I don't doubt any of the questions that that have gone unanswered will be unanswered forever. Most of the answers I have gathered for his questions I've found alone on one resource, the Bible Project. The rest I was able to go and Google within a reasonable amount of time. This was still a lot of work though, because he asks a lot of questions and lists a lot of potential contradictions. I'm probably, for the sake of time and sheer repetitiveness, won't be going through every contradiction, because from the research that I have done, all the answers start to look similar. But we're going to begin the video now, and I'm going to play snippets at a time, and then I'm going to comment on what we've listened to. So, starting from the beginning.
Some people said that I shouldn't do this debate with this question. It's kind of an impossible question. It's the kind of question that requires more of an explanation to ask than to answer, which is a little bit strange. So I thought, the Bible is not a book. It's a library, and like any good library, it contains an amalgamation of different genres. And so asking if the Bible is true, you might as well ask if the corpus of Shakespeare is true. It sort of betrays a misunderstanding of how people interact with the text. So I thought, will Dinesh argue that the Bible is literally true, historically true, allegorically true, morally true, theologically true, metaphorically true? And I suppose the only thing for it is to sort of try each one on for size.
So, beginning with how he has laid out his argument, I'm actually totally okay with this. In essence, he has laid out how we need to consider interpreting Scripture. This is true. If there is a portion of allegory, or if there is a portion of metaphor, we do need to ask, what is the allegory trying to say? What is the metaphor trying to say? Unfortunately, as we continue down the video, Alex himself doesn't seem to hold to this rule, and it happens fairly early on. I'm going to play what I believe is the first section now. It's sort of the first minute or two into the video.
So maybe beginning with Genesis, in an attempt, clearly not at historicity, but rather allegory and metaphor, we can deal with one of our types of truth here. We're introduced to Adam and Eve, who are told in no uncertain terms by God not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You may begin to wonder why knowledge of good and evil is such a bad thing, but the thought is interrupted by the introduction of the serpent.
So I'm going to potentially keep going backwards a bit just so I can make comments and then pick up on where we were so it doesn't seem like I'm skipping things or chopping between things. So Alex begins here by admitting that we should have a look at Genesis, at least from some sort of point of allegory or metaphor. The question that Alex therefore then must ask himself is an allegory and a metaphor for what exactly? This is important because if he doesn't know what claim this chunk of the Bible is making, he can't actually rightly assess it. I'm going to give you an example. If a semi-professional chess player says, "I'm the best at chess," there are two things they're likely to be implying by this statement. One, more likely than the other. Remember, this is a semi-professional chess player. The likely option is that they're implying they are the best out of everyone that they have so far versed, or at least the best amongst the average person. This could very well be the truth. If I know someone who is a semi-professional chess player, I'd probably go around telling them that I know the best chess player ever. We use language like that all the time. This is purely exaggeratory, allegorical, metaphorical language. This is not literal, so you cannot judge my statement from a literal perspective. Continuing on, the less likely option is that they are implying that they are the best, period. This is not true, as they are only semi-professional. We need to know what claim the Bible is making exactly before we can assess it at its level of truth, right? Simply taking the words at whatever value we interpret them at is not good enough. So, I'll go back a little bit.
Certain terms by God not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You may begin to wonder why knowledge of good and evil is such a bad thing, but the thought is interrupted by the introduction of the serpent, who says to Eve, "Did God say that if you eat of the tree, then in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die?" And Eve says, "Yes." And the serpent says, "Well, that's not going to happen. God just knows that if you eat of it, you'll become like him, knowing good and evil, and he doesn't want that. That's all. You're not going to die." So Eve famously takes the fruit, eats some, gives some to Adam, and what happens? Do they die in the day thereof? I'm
going to pause here quickly. So already we have a conundrum. Alex has said we're going to look at this from a metaphorical and allegorical perspective. And he asks, well, do they die in the day thereof? Asking, do they literally die? Do they literally die? Asking a literal question of something that he said that he would assess at a allegorical or metaphorical level. So we've already got a problem here. We continue on with this problem where Alex even admits that the metaphorical interpretation is actually an option.
Some people say in a metaphorical sense, yes. We'll get to that in a second, but at least on the surface of it, no.
At least on the surface of it, no. On the surface of it, literally, we already have a problem where Alex is not actually abiding by the rules that he laid out for the argument to begin with. So we already have a huge inconsistency in terms of how he's arguing this, and this continues. But I will try not to pause this too much, and we'll keep going.
What does happen? God tells us himself. He says, "Now the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and eat from the tree of life, lest he inherit eternal life." And with this, Adam and Eve are banished from the Garden of Eden. So who's telling the truth here? This story is quite mystifying to me, and I'm not the first.
So Alex has given a brief summary of the story regarding Adam and Eve and the apple and how man has essentially fallen from the peaceful world and the peaceful ecosystem in the Garden of Eden that God once granted them. At the crux of all of his questioning, he says, who is telling the truth here? By the law of Genesis, obviously God is telling the truth. So what has Satan told as a lie? He also says, this story is quite mystifying to me. The problem with this line of questioning and the statement of this story being quite mystifying, as I said before at the top of the video, it doesn't take too long to actually hop onto a Bible Project summary and to actually listen to their researched scholarly summary of the beginning of Genesis. They actually outline it quite clearly what the point of this chunk of the book is. I'm going to do my best to surmise it in an even shorter period of time, but you can actually answer the question and unmystify this story. To help unmystify the story, there's actually a better question that Alex could be asking here. I believe the better question is, what are they all claiming and which claims are true? This is a question that operates within the allegory and assesses the claims that the Bible is actually making. This will also give us a kind of launch pad to help unmystify the story a little bit. Satan is claiming that God doesn't want Adam and Eve to know what God knows, with a seemingly selfish implication here, along with the idea that you won't die, implying that you won't lose your life, something that I think Alex has kind of fallen for. All twisted versions of the truth, by the way. God later proves himself as speaking the truth and showing the serpent as the truth twister. God was never selfish, as the serpent seemingly implies, but was actually giving Adam and Eve a choice. Alex also asks why the knowledge of good and evil are such bad things. Well, once again, this is something that we can look into a little further and answer. I'm going to give some points here and hopefully answer this question. Do Adam and Eve trust God's definition of what is good, or take the risk of being exposed to all of good and evil and have to decide for themselves? Out of an act of either distrust or selfish ambition, we chose to try on knowledge we didn't have the holiness to wield. And God did not want us to wield it forever, so he locked off the tree of life. God had to allow this choice to give us free will of some sort, to choose to follow his word or make our own way. Now that we have much more context, this is where Alex should be beginning his questioning from about Genesis's trustworthiness. I don't believe Alex is actually questioning the trustworthiness of this portion of the Bible from the correct set of claims. Things only get worse from here, though.
To point this out, there's actually an apocryphal gospel discovered near Nag Hammadi in Egypt in the 1940s, dated into around the 2nd or 3rd century, called the Testimony of Truth, a gospel that didn't make it into the New Testament, which identifies the serpent, interestingly, who's never called Satan in the text, by the way, identifies the serpent with Jesus. I don't know if I'd go quite that far, but it does seem that the sort of allegorical truth of the story leaves a lot to be desired. I'm told that maybe Adam and Eve died a sort of spiritual death, or mortality entered the world. But then we need to ask why it is that God had to proactively banish them from the Garden of Eden.
There's a lot to unpack here. Alex makes a claim about the apocryphal gospel. I have had a look into this apocryphal gospel called the Testimony of Truth. Mind you, this is a gospel that did not make it into the New Testament or anywhere into scriptures, so it's very difficult to actually use this as a claim against the Bible because it never made it into the Bible to begin with. So if it's a contradiction within the Bible, he should probably be using things that actually made it into the Bible rather than outside texts. Alex is kind enough to pardon the idea that this apocryphal gospel claims that Jesus was the snake. This is a easy mistake to make if you haven't looked into the Hebrew. There's a lot of lingual links where Jesus could be compared to a serpent in one regard, and it's a similar word used as the serpent in the garden. but the meaning of the word changes when it is applied to Jesus versus the meaning of the word when it is applied to the serpent in the garden, for clarification. As I said before, anything in this account sort of means nothing to me because it didn't make it in the Bible. Just because a statement or an account exists does not mean it has any viability, and Alex needs to prove why this apocryphal gospel has any weight to it at all. He later actually claims to then question the completeness of the Bible. I'll get to that, but this is an incredibly overconfident statement because he is implying that the Bible may not be complete, and that would imply that he or someone else knows what the complete Bible should look like. So then my question would be, Alex, what does a complete Bible look like? What is it missing? He then asks the question, why did God have to proactively banish them from the garden? He quite literally has the correct answer here and then says, I find this quite strange. To save time, I'm not really going to repeat what I said earlier and just move on, but I'll play this section again just so you can hear it.
Had to proactively banish them from the Garden of Eden. This isn't some natural result of sin that, mortality entered the world. They're banished. And the implication is that they could have just as easily reached out and eaten from the tree of life, but God didn't want this to happen. So he guards the gates of Eden with a cherubim, with a flaming sword. I find this quite strange, and I'd like to know what Dinesh thinks of it. Moving on quickly, I suppose, to the events of the later Old Testament, skipping over Exodus, we're introduced to another form of truth that I want to potentially engage in, and that's the concept of moral truth. That's another one.
I'm going to pause here because engaging in moral truth is a very, very, very uphill battle, especially when you're coming from the atheistic perspective. Now, I'm going to do my best to explain this concept in a not eternal period of time, but if you want to understand this idea a bit better, I highly recommend having a look at some debates online. There are some debates that do a really good job of questioning the origins of morality between Christians and atheists. I think if you just find some of the more popular debaters, people like William Lane Craig or John Lennox or what have you, you'll usually find that not only do these two do a good job of representing the Christian argument, but they're usually debating people who do a good job of representing the atheistic argument as well. But I'll outline the two major issues here by starting with a moral argument. So the first issue is that for Alex to be able to appeal to moral truth, he has to be able to claim that he has a moral truth I should subject myself to in the first place. Otherwise, anything he claims, I have the equal right to claim otherwise. So he is automatically coming in from an uphill battle. I've got a pretty full-on example. I'm hoping this might portray the issue a bit better. If I could prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that killing off all homeless people harms less people and benefits more people, seemingly through a better distribution of wealth, I could claim that killing homeless people is a moral act. What do I mean by that? So, if I could say that killing off a whole bunch of homeless people is doing less damage than it is doing more good, so let's say it does 5 degrees of damage but does 10 degrees of good, there's kind of this almost statistical argument to say, well, now that we don't have this like distribution of wealth going to the poor and the needy, it feels gross even saying that. Now we can use all this wealth for infrastructure, and this infrastructure is going to greatly improve the lives of those who are not poor and needy. So on a statistical basis, we're drastically improving the lives of so many more people because most people, especially in first world countries, are not poor and needy. Alex has a conundrum here. He would either have to agree because it's a statistic to fuel morality in a godless world, or he would have to disagree and attempt to evidence why it's not morally correct. In the second case, we have two people who disagree with each other, and Alex would have to explain where he got his idea of morality from, even though there's no evidence backing him. Pack mentality can't save him either. Otherwise, we could, to invoke a classic argument, look at the idea of somewhere like Germany. In the vacuum of Germany, pack mentality won, right? In World War II, for context. On top of this, if God is real, he has to prove his morality is better than an all-knowing God. Once again, an impossibly uphill thing to prove. Here's the second issue, right? And I might actually play what Alex says first, and then I'll address the second issue.
One that I spoke about in the beginning just there, the concept of moral truth. When we look at some of the military conquests of the Old Testament, bear in mind that the promised land pledged to Abraham is not an empty plain. Its indigenous inhabitants had to be, shall we say, displaced by a series of military campaigns ordered by God and carried out by his prophets. Thus we have such commands as in Deuteronomy chapter 20. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. Sounds promising to start with. If they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. Some peace. If they refuse to make peace and engage you in battle, which, why would they do that on these terms? Lay siege to that city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all the men in it. As for the women, the children, and the livestock, and everything else in the city, they get to go... You may take these as plunder for yourselves, that's right. And you may use the plunder the Lord your God gives you from your enemies. Likewise, in 1 Samuel, we have the destruction of the Amalekites. There's the order, now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. I'm told sometimes that this is actually an exercise in hyperbole. God didn't mean everyone. It continues, do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. And if you think that this is hyperbole, consider what happens when Saul does conduct the destruction of the Amalekites as ordered and decides to leave alive the king as well as some of the best of the livestock. He leaves them alive. For this small act of mercy, God responds by saying to the prophet Samuel, I regret that I have made Saul king because he's turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. So not even the animals can escape this genocide. So I'd like to ask Dinesh, I suppose, directly, which is it? Is this a morally corrupt series of events, or do I have to dispel with my moral intuition that genocide, including of innocent children, is a bad thing? There's plenty more to talk.
Alex spends the next 2 minutes talking about two instances that he uses to evidence his claims that there is a moral untrustworthiness associated with the Bible. The first instance is Deuteronomy 20. What Alex doesn't mention is that Deuteronomy is actually a set of laws given to ancient Israel when the times were different, to set them apart from their neighbors and to get them on a better track. There's good reason why we can assume that the other tribes nearby needed to be, let's say, contended with. The other neighbors had different codes of conduct that were far worse than the instructions given in Deuteronomy. They abided by things like the Code of Ur-Nammu, the Middle Assyrian laws, or the Code of Hammurabi. I hope I pronounced those correctly. If you get time, please do yourself a favor and have a look at something like the Middle Assyrian laws and understand that if ancient Israel hadn't prevailed over the other neighboring tribes, these were the laws that would have succeeded instead. And these laws were far worse than what Alex has just described. Remember, this was set a long, long time ago. God is trying to work with the people where they're at, and they were at a much more morally deplorable place, and he was trying to pick them up and set them on a path to holiness in some way, shape, or form. He then continues on to talk about 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel is, once again, a difficult period of the Bible. Samuel was showing a period where Israel was transitioning from a group of tribes, seemingly in wild moral chaos, to more of a kingdom. What Alex left out is that the Amalekites, before this, had instigated many attempts at violence with the Israelites. he conveniently skips over Exodus, which contains the story of the Amalekites attacking Israel and Moses. Their determination, or their motivations, are to wipe out the people of God, to, in a way, commit a genocide-ish on the people who call themselves believers. There's an article on the Gospel Coalition that outlines a lot of this, called Saul and the Amalekite Genocide. Once again, if you were to be a truth seeker, or if Alex were to be a truth seeker, he would probably want to read this article and approach it with more contextual understanding.
Mercy, God responds by saying to the prophet Samuel, I regret that I have made Saul king because he's turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. So not even the animals can escape this genocide. So I'd like to ask Dinesh, I suppose, directly, which is it? Is this a morally corrupt series of events, or do I have to dispel with my moral intuition that genocide, including of innocent children, is a bad thing?
To cap off this section of his argument, the moral section, Alex finishes by giving two wrong alternatives. He says, is this a morally corrupt series of events, or does he dispel that a genocide of children is a bad thing? To sum up two very deep-rooted and complicated historical events with these two watered-down remarks is actually bad faith at this point. These stories don't at all give these two options as moral conclusions. In fact, once again, Alex is coming at this from an angle that the Bible is not coming at. Reading through both books, you actually see that God did not want these things to happen exactly like this in the first place. But he has to deal with large groups of free individuals. God's plan was far greater than this to begin with. The people of the day did not always listen to him, so disobedience got them into horrible situations, and their own disobedience required sacrifice at times to amend. A simple analogy, but not at all encompassing, would be if a child wishes to go play in the bushes. Their parent says, I don't recommend this. Play in the open park space. The bushes will injure you. The child doesn't listen and jumps straight into the bushes, sticking themselves in the foot with a branch. Not only did the child suffer damage from the disobedience, but to amend the situation, the child now has to disinfect the wound and walk on an injured foot for a while. Amending this process is also painful. All of this could have been avoided if they listened to the wise parent in the first place. As I said, this is not an all-encompassing analogy for the deep-rooted concerns and issues that happened back in the days of Deuteronomy and Exodus and Samuel, but I believe this is much closer to the moral claim that the Bible is trying to communicate here than the two alternatives that Alex has seemed to have provided. We then also get a side remark from Alex here.
There's plenty more to talk about in that regard. I don't want to take up too much time. This isn't, of course, to mention the advocacy and explicit instructions around slavery in the Old Testament. Hopefully we can get onto those too if we want to go down the moral path.
He also talks about the advocacy and explicit instruction around slavery. This is something that I believe has been mentioned in some of my past episodes from a man named Dr. Gordon Menzies, who is like a great mentor figure to me. And he has this one line, which I think is a great little line to keep in your pocket, which is, description does not equal prescription. Just because the Bible is describing events of slavery and describing instructions around slavery does not mean that the Bible actually enjoys the concept of slavery to begin with. There's two other points here that I want listeners to investigate if they can. The first one is that slavery for some people and for some tribes actually looked more like welfare rather than the ownership and enslavement, I guess, now in our language, of people in a derogatory and horrible way. These were people who, to begin with, would say, hey, I'm on the streets, I have nowhere to live, and then a wealthy person would say, I will clothe you, I will feed you, I will house you, but come and work for me. And some of them were even elevated to these positions where they were able to teach the children of the house. They were able to be almost like masters of the household who would coordinate things and have almost like an appreciative role within the family. This obviously did not stop people from misusing the concept as well. So, in the same way that you can have people that use alcohol responsibly, you can have people who use alcohol irresponsibly. The other point that I wanted to make is that the advocacy of slavery is something that Alex would have to prove on the Bible's terms of advocacy. The Bible advocates for things in a way that is very clear. When the Bible is advocating for an idea, it usually makes that advocacy quite clear. For example, the commandments or the fruits of the Spirit, or when Jesus talks about, that love is a priority and loving the Lord your God is something that he advocates for. These are all very clear advocacies where he says, go and do these things, right? Alex would have to prove that the Bible as a whole, as an entirety, one of its goals is to institute slavery. This is just not the case.
I think that the most natural interpretation of the question is the concept of historicity, the literal.
Here, Alex begins to appeal to historicity and literal truth now.
Truth of the Bible, that is. This is where I think we have to move to the New Testament, because the genre of the Gospel seems to be historical biography, unlike the mythology of a book like the Psalms or Genesis or Job. And here there's a lot to talk about. We begin with the birth narratives. There are two birth narratives in the Gospels, in Matthew and Luke. Both give different accounts. Both have a genealogy of Jesus, for example, but the genealogies are different. I'm told this is because one records Mary's genealogy and one records Joseph's. You can do this if you like. It doesn't seem like the most natural reading of the text if you're not already predisposed to synchronize the accounts. Then we have, for example, the flight to Egypt, which is only recorded in Luke, which is difficult to reconcile with Matthew's account that they went to the temple in Jerusalem instead. But more importantly, Matthew then says that the family traveled to Nazareth, and he says, so was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he shall be called a Nazarene, quoting the prophets. Now you'll notice if you read an online Bible that where the Old Testament prophets are quoted, there's a little footnote telling you what the prophecy is. In this case, you won't find one, because the prophecy simply doesn't exist. It's not there. There's no such thing. So there are two options here. Either Matthew made up this prophecy or got it wrong, in which case the New Testament is mistaken, or the prophecy does exist, but for some reason fell out of our scriptural tradition and now no longer exists, which makes the accuracy and at least the completeness of the Old Testament suspect. So again, I'd like to ask directly which.
There's a lot of claims, again, that Alex has made, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to debunk all of them. I want to pay particular attention to the issue of the missing prophecy that Alex has brought up here. The conclusion that Alex has arrived at is because the prophecy doesn't exist in the Bible, there are two options. Either A, it was made up, or it B, fell out, and then this questions the accuracy and the completeness of the Bible. This is not at all the only two options that we have. Once again, with option B, the questioning the accuracy and the completeness of the Bible, you have to ask, then what would a complete Old Testament look like? There were far more prophecies, and there were far more miracles, and there were far more stories that probably could have entered the Bible, but they didn't. The prophecy not being in the Bible does not necessarily mean that the Bible itself is incomplete. I would actually argue that the prophecy did not need to be in the Bible to allow the Bible to do its job.
It is. Finally, I suppose I should mention the the contradictions that a lot of people point to in the Gospels. Some of these, I think, are legitimate, some are not. I'll give you some examples very quickly of Gospel contradictions that I do think are real contradictions. First, the date of Jesus.
To begin with, he's already said Gospel contradictions that I believe are real contradictions. We have to ask ourselves what he means by that. Real contradictions, as in they really are big enough to question the trustworthiness of the Bible, or they're real contradictions, as in they're contradictions and they really contradict themselves. Because those two are two different issues, and both of them are incorrect. For the sake of time, I will address some of these contradictions. I won't address all of them. I more want to just show that whatever contradictions Alex brings up here, either they are debunkable, or if they haven't been debunked yet, they're not big enough contradictions to actually question the trustworthiness of the statements that the Bible is making.
Jesus' crucifixion. Was it before the Passover, as John states, or was it after the Passover, as the Synoptic Gospels state?
In this case, the before or after contradiction of the Passover being the time of the crucifixion, there is seemingly an answer to this. Scholars seem to agree that the Synoptic Gospels are the correct answer, right? John isn't actually incorrect in his answer either. In Luke 22 verses 1, we find a hint to the answer in this. It says, "Now the festival of unleavened bread, called the Passover, was approaching." The festival of unleavened bread is what John called the Passover. And in the Synoptics, the Passover is what they called the Passover. We can also see this evident in Mark 14:12 and in John 19:14. So there is evidence for this claim. I'm not just cherry picking one verse. Date-wise, the Synoptics are correct. John simply just used an interchangeable term for the festival of unleavened bread. If Alex was honest in his querying of this, he wouldn't simply stop there and look into this being the case. On top of that, I want to go back to my original point. The set of verses here are not trying to create a historical point. They're trying, or historical point around a specific date, rather. They're trying to create a historical point around the fact that the crucifixion did happen. We continue on.
Second, Jesus is sending out his disciples to teach. In Mark, he tells them to take nothing with them except a staff. In Matthew and Luke, he says, take nothing with them, including no staff. So do they take a staff or do they not? A pedantic contradiction, but a contradiction nonetheless, and one that's led people like Barnabas, Ahern, to write entire articles on this. And Augustine himself actually distinguished between a literal staff and a metaphorical staff to explain this difference. Anything, I suppose, except considering the possibility of even the most minor of gospel contradictions. Third, Jesus flipping the tables at
the staff or no staff contradiction, once again, is not the point of that section of scripture. This is about when the Lord is sending out a whole group of people to go and do his works. The idea of not taking belongings with you is to show that when the Lord sends you, he will provide for you in all things. There's actually something that Alex brings up is Barnabas Ahern. He makes a whole bunch of potential arguments for what this could be. Some of them are lingual issues, some of them are contextual issues. The writing styles back then need to be taken into account because there was so many different interchangeable meanings for simple words like we have in our English language. Alex has seemingly chosen a actually quite bad faith interpretation by just cherry picking Augustine rather than doing further research and seeing what scholars have actually said about the matter. Alex hasn't looked into what is the most likely possibility. He's just kind of looked into the one that he dislikes the most. And once again, this is not the point that this section is historically trying to make. They're showing that historically in through literal evidence that whenever the Lord sent people, that they were provided for. That was the goal.
The temple. A famous story, but did you know that in the Gospel of John, this takes place at the beginning of Jesus' ministry? In the Synoptics, it takes place near the end. So when did that occur? Mary Magdalene, after the resurrection of Jesus, runs to the disciples in John's Gospel and says, "They've taken the Lord, and we do not know where they have put him." Strange thing for her to say if, as the Gospel of Matthew recounts, she's visited by an angel at the tomb who tells her exactly where Jesus is going, and then she's met by Jesus herself on the way to the disciples to bring them the news. Strange for her to then say that they've taken the Lord and we do not know where they've put him. There's more to say on this. Interpolations, things which seem not to be in our oldest manuscripts but end up in newer manuscripts of the New Testament, such as the adulterous woman, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." Most scholars agree that this was not in our earliest manuscripts and was added in at a later date. And if we can see that the gospel stories were edited after they were written down, there's no reason to think that they couldn't be edited before they were written down as oral traditions too, as well as the entire ending of Mark 16. There's a longer version and a shorter version, because the longer version simply isn't in our earlier manuscripts. These documents don't seem to have the historical reliability either. So, in conclusion,
This is where I'm probably going to stop debunking each and every point. Alex made about 5 or 6 different statements here about things that he thinks are contradictions. I'm going to, for the final time, put forward my original argument. When Alex wants to bring up these contradictions and argue that these debunk the trustworthiness of the Bible, he needs to actually understand exactly what claims are being made in the Bible here to begin with. These contradictions can exist. Let's say all of these contradictions were true. They don't actually debunk the original claims that those sections of scripture are actually trying to make. A lot of these contradictions, apparently, in air quotations, do have answers. I'll say this simply, that it did not take me very long whenever I did go looking for answers about these contradictions to find something that was far closer to what the Bible was actually claiming. On top of that, I can recommend many resources on top of a simple Google that can help you as the listener to go and find these answers for yourself. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, the Bible Project is a great place to start. One resource that I have personally been using a lot and I highly, highly recommend is my good friend from Questioning Christianity. He has a YouTube channel, he has a website, he has a whole bunch of community pages that you can go on and you can ask questions like this and find answers. They do exist. I'm going to cap it off here and say that when it comes to truth seeking, while Alex's arguments here may seem quite powerful and notable against the truth claims or the trustworthiness against the Bible, once they are unpacked even slightly, they seem to entirely unravel themselves, because Alex is not approaching trustworthiness in the criteria that he actually set out for himself. I hope this was beneficial for you as the listener, and I hope that this gives you potential tools to assess people's claims against Scripture and to be able to advocate for or to help you research in your future endeavors for the trustworthiness of the Bible.